London, November 3, 1897. The air was thick with a damp fog that turned the city's streets into shadowy corridors, almost impenetrable by the lamplight. The temperature hovered around 12 degrees, with the wind howling through the alleys like an old ghost whispering ancient secrets. But there, around Buckingham Palace, silence reigned in an almost unnatural way. Behind the wrought iron gates, the royal residence seemed like a fortress of mysteries, its dark windows gazing at the outside world with an air of disdain. Something terrible was hidden there, something the city would never dare to suspect. I had received a letter the previous morning. The royal family seal, engraved in red wax, stared ominously at me as I hesitated to open the envelope. Inside, a message written in elegant yet hurried handwriting begged for my immediate presence at the palace. It wasn't a request, but an order, a summons to deal with something that defied nature, as vaguely and darkly described in the letter. I, Jonathan Elwood, am a historian and cryptologist specializing in ancient legends and hidden mysteries. In recent years, I have been called upon to solve riddles that few would dare to confront. But there was something different about this request. It carried an urgency I had never felt before. My hands sweated as I reread the message, and the final part filled me with unease. Come immediately, tell no one. Complete this mission, and your name will be etched in the annals of history. By nightfall, I stood before Buckingham's imposing gates, where a coachman waited to take me inside. As we moved through the palace's long corridors, the silence was deafening, as if the very building were holding its breath, waiting for something. What could the monarchy be hiding that was so dreadful? My boots echoed on the stone floor as two guards led me through increasingly claustrophobic passageways. Finally, we arrived at a dimly lit room, where I was introduced to Lord Albert, a thin and pale man, his eyes bearing the exhaustion of sleepless nights. "Mr. Elwood," he greeted me, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We thank you for coming on such short notice. Something terrible has happened, and your reputation as an investigator of inexplicable phenomena precedes you." I stared at him, waiting for him to explain the real reason I was there, but he hesitated, his hand trembling as he held an ornate silver cane. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted, running his hand through his thinning, sweat-dampened hair. "There is something in the palace's underground, something we can't explain or contain. We've tried everything, but the thing, it grows stronger by the day." My eyebrows arched, and my heart raced as I heard his words. What could this something be that terrified even the most powerful men in England? "What is this thing?" I asked, trying to control the disbelief in my voice. He hesitated again before answering. "It's a creature, a beast, something that defies all reason." "A beast?" I repeated, feeling my stomach churn. He nodded, and without further words, he led me down a narrow staircase hidden behind an old tapestry. The smell of mold and decay grew stronger as we descended. The air below was heavy, as if the darkness itself had weight, and the walls seemed to close in around us. Lord Albert's lantern flickered, and I could hear the sound of something dragging itself through the corridors further down. After what felt like hours of descending, we reached a massive iron door. Lord Albert paused before it, hesitating for a moment before inserting the key into the lock. His fingers trembled, and I could feel the palpable fear in his face. When the door finally creaked open, the air that escaped was unbearable. It smelled of death, of rotting flesh mixed with something else, something I had never encountered before. We entered a vast, cavernous room. Darkness dominated the place, except for a few spots where the lantern's light revealed a stone floor marked by claw scratches. I heard a guttural sound in the distance, something that seemed to echo off the walls, and a chill ran down my spine. "What happened here?" I barely managed to whisper, my voice choked by the fear that was beginning to take hold of me. Lord Albert replied in a strained voice. "It was many years ago. In 1827, King George IV ordered the construction of an underground expansion of the palace. During the excavations, they found something that should have remained buried." He paused, his eyes lost in the darkness ahead of us. An ancient chamber, much older than the palace or even the city. Inside there were inscriptions in a language none of the scholars of the time could decipher. Along with the inscriptions, There was a massive stone door. The workers, curious and ignorant of the dangers, opened it. And then, something awoke. My heart pounded, and the weight of the situation began to crush me. Something had been unleashed decades ago, and since then, it had been growing in power, trapped in the depths of the palace. A creature that had been sealed away by history itself, perhaps for a very good reason. I didn't know if what I was hearing was truth or delirium, but deep down I could feel that something very real was there, something ancient and malevolent. Suddenly the sound returned, louder and closer this time, a deep growl, almost like heavy breathing that made the floor tremble beneath our feet. "It's here," Lord Albert whispered, his eyes wide with terror. At that moment, the lantern flickered, nearly going out, and something moved in the shadows. My eyes struggled to focus on the darkness, but all I could make out was a glint, two large red eyes emerging from the gloom. It wasn't human. It was something far worse. A monstrous silhouette began to form, its contours irrational and grotesque, as if the darkness itself were shaping the creature. "It watches us," Lord Albert murmured, stepping back hesitantly. "It has always watched us." Suddenly the growl turned into a sharp scream, a sound that seemed to come from an ancient nightmare. The creature lunged at us with terrifying speed, and all I could do was run. My feet slipped on the damp stone, and I felt the icy wind of the creature's passage brush against my skin. Behind me, I heard Lord Albert's muffled scream cut off abruptly. I ran, without looking back. My body acted on pure survival instinct, every fiber of my being screaming to escape that cursed place. I raced up the steps in panic, the sound of the creature's claws striking the stone echoing down the corridors. The smell of fresh blood filled the air, and terror consumed me, choking out any rational thought. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, locking it with every bolt I could find. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline kept me alert, but the silence after the chaos was even more terrifying. I stood there trying to catch my breath and calm my mind, but an overwhelming certainty hit me. That thing, that beast, was not truly contained. Not for long. As I left the palace that night, the London sky seemed heavier, almost as if it were pressing down on the city with a shroud of eternal darkness. Something was buried deep beneath Buckingham, something far older and more evil than anyone could imagine. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this dark secret wouldn't stay buried for long. The royal palace, symbol of power and stability, harbored in its depths a living curse, something that sooner or later would escape again, bringing chaos and destruction with it. I survived that night, but the cost was high. My sleep was never the same again, my dreams always haunted by those red eyes, glowing in the darkness, lurking, waiting. And every time I see Buckingham Palace in the distance, I can't help but feel the same chill down my spine, because I know the beast is down there, waiting patiently, and when it finally emerges, no one will be prepared for the horror it will bring to the world. After that terrifying night, my body and mind never returned to their former state. Even as I tried to resume my daily life, something kept pulling me back to the palace. The feeling that the monster was watching me, even from afar, made every breath a reminder of the abyss I had faced. Weeks passed, and life in London went on as usual. The newspapers mentioned nothing of Lord Albert or any incidents at Buckingham. I learned, through letters and rumors exchanged among noble families, that his absence was explained as a prolonged illness. But I knew the truth. Lord Albert was dead, torn from our world by something that shouldn't exist. I isolated myself in my apartment in Westminster, and there, surrounded by old books and manuscripts that I could barely decipher, I tried to understand what had happened. I plunged into texts on mythological creatures and ancient rituals, hoping to find some reference to that underground chamber and its monstrous inhabitant. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I had to return. One night, my torment was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. The sound was almost like a death sentence. When I opened it, I found a short man wearing a dark cloak, and behind him, the unmistakable golden glow of a royal carriage. He said nothing, only handed me a letter, the same red wax seal adorning the envelope. The contents were simple and direct. Your presence is required again at Buckingham Palace. The matter is of utmost urgency. This will be your last chance to resolve what was unleashed. My breath caught for a moment. I knew I had no choice. Some force beyond understanding was pulling me back to that hell. This time, it wouldn't be curiosity that guided me, but the certainty that if I didn't act, something even more terrible would happen. When I arrived at the palace, everything felt different. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very air were saturated with an invisible evil. I was silently led through the now familiar corridors to the presence of none other than Queen Victoria herself. Seeing her, I was immediately struck by the shock. She was not the imposing figure I had expected. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dark-circled, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. "Mr. Elwood," she said, her voice deep but frail, "I know you have faced the horror lurking beneath this palace. I also know you understand what is at stake. Your Majesty, what exactly is this creature?" I asked bluntly. "And why have I been summoned back?" She hesitated for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "The monster you saw is not just any creature. It is something much older than the kingdom itself. In times long past, the beast was imprisoned by kings who no longer exist in history, and their intentions were clear: to seal the evil forever, to bury it where it could never again cause destruction. But our ambition and ignorance have reopened that wound." She looked at me with an intensity that made me shudder. "Now, what you saw is growing stronger. Every day that passes, the barriers that confine it weaken, and if it escapes, it will be the end." Her words weighed like lead. There was a grim truth there, one I had never considered. That being was not just a threat to the palace, but to the entire world. I felt like a pawn in a game far larger than I could comprehend. The Queen handed me a scroll, old and faded, with inscriptions that seemed from a time far before our civilization. I didn't recognize the language, but its structure was familiar. A code, a key perhaps to lock the creature away again. But time was not on our side. "The scroll was found with the chamber," the Queen explained. "Scholars believe it contains the ritual that can seal the beast, but no one has been able to decipher it, no human so far." She paused, watching me expectantly. "We believe you may be the only hope to prevent the worst." I held the scroll in trembling hands. It felt as though, within its fragile paper, lay humanity's last hope. But there was a problem. This was not just a cryptic text, it was something far more complex. Its words, though incomprehensible, carried a sense of weight, as if each symbol held a fragment of a curse. "I will do my best, Your Majesty," I murmured, with no real confidence in my ability to win this battle. Then she revealed something that froze my blood. "There is one more thing you need to know, Mr. Elwood. The beast. It has already begun to influence those who live in the palace. Guards have disappeared, servants have gone mad, and I—" Her voice faltered, and for a brief moment I saw tears in her eyes. "I myself hear it in my dreams. It whispers, calling me to open the doors. Every night is a struggle not to give in. Time is running out, and I fear that soon I may no longer be able to resist." The gravity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just trapped in its lair, it was infiltrating the minds of those around it, eroding their internal defenses. If the Queen herself was on the verge of succumbing, how long before everyone inside became pawns of its will? I returned to the underground chamber, this time accompanied by a team of scholars who believed they could help translate the scroll. The darkness down there felt even denser, more oppressive than before. The smell of rot, of something that should never have been unearthed, was suffocating. As we approached the room where the creature was confined, I could feel a presence, as if the very darkness was alive, watching each of us. With the scroll open before me, I worked for hours, trying to break the code. But the creature knew what we were doing. Its growls and snarls echoed off the walls, and I could feel its anger, its hunger. With each word deciphered, it seemed as though the air around us grew heavier, denser. The creature was fighting against the seal I was trying to reconstruct, like a prisoner battling its chains. And then, in the most critical moment, silence. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow all the sounds of the world. "Did we succeed?" whispered one of the scholars, fear etched on his face. But before I could respond, the doors of the chamber burst open with a thunderous crash, and what emerged was not just the creature, but a much more terrifying form. a version of it that had transcended what I had seen before. It had fed on fear, on despair, and now it was something bigger, more powerful. Its claws scraped the stone walls and its eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence. I ran. We all ran, but we knew there was nowhere to go. As we ran, the sound of the creature's claws reverberated down the narrow, stifling corridors beneath Buckingham Palace. Every step we took echoed like funeral drums, while the air grew heavier, saturated with the malevolent presence pursuing us. The creature, now freed from the chains that had confined it for centuries, seemed to toy with us, moving through the shadows like a predator, savoring the anticipation of its kill. My mind raced frantically. The ritual had failed, or worse, maybe I had performed it incorrectly. The scroll, whose words I believed I was deciphering, contained a curse more complex than anything I had ever encountered. And now, instead of sealing the evil away, I had unleashed it fully. My mistake would cost lives, perhaps far more than I could imagine. The sound of panting breaths and hurried footsteps filled the space around us as we climbed the stairs leading back to the palace's upper levels. But with every step left behind, I felt the invisible weight of the creature at our heels. It was as if the very air was alive, vibrating with the expectation of the moment it would catch us. We reached a heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. With all my strength, I pushed it open, spilling into the illuminated hall beyond. When the last person passed through, I slammed the door shut, bolting it with a heavy latch. All the scholars who had accompanied me stood pale-faced, their eyes wide with terror. Their bodies trembled uncontrollably, just like mine. For a brief moment, silence took over the corridor, broken only by our ragged breaths. But soon, the air around us seemed to warp. A guttural growl echoed from the other side of the door, followed by scratches like sharp claws tearing at the thick wood. We all knew, instinctively, that this barrier wouldn't hold the creature for long. "What now?" asked one of the scholars, his voice thick with anguish. "What do we do now?" The answer was stuck in my throat, along with the fear. I didn't know. The weight of responsibility for that disaster crushed my soul, and my mind struggled in vain to find a solution. The truth was clear. I had unleashed something beyond human control. We weren't just victims. I was complicit in this horror. One thought cut through my mind like a sharp blade. The Queen. She was at the center of all this, more connected to the creature than any of us. Her weakened mental state, her confession about the beast's whispers invading her dreams, there was something she hadn't fully revealed. The key to stopping the creature, or at least containing it, might be tied to the Queen in a way we didn't yet understand. "We have to go to the Queen," I said, my voice sounding firmer than I felt. "She knows more than she's told us. If there's any hope of containing this thing, it lies with her." The scholars looked at me hesitantly, but deep down, they knew I was right. With no other choice, we left the door creaking under the creature's attack and ran through the corridors toward the Queen's chambers. Every room we passed seemed infused with a darkness that rooted itself in the walls, a harbinger of what was to come. The palace, once a symbol of stability and power, now felt like a cursed labyrinth, where the very architecture twisted into threatening shapes. When we finally reached the golden doors of the royal chambers, 2 guards stood in front of them, their expressions tense, and their eyes filled with dread. As we approached, they crossed their spears in a swift motion. "No one enters," one of them barked, his eyes betraying fear. "The Queen cannot be disturbed." "We are in a desperate situation," I responded, trying to push past them. "The palace is under threat, and only the Queen has the answers." The guards remained firm, but before another word could be said, a fragile and familiar voice spoke from behind the door. "Let them in," the Queen ordered, her voice weak, almost a sigh. The guards reluctantly obeyed, opening the doors to reveal Queen Victoria seated in her chair, her small frame almost swallowed by the heavy fabrics of her royal robes. The room was bathed in shadows, with only the faint light from a fireplace illuminating her face. She looked older and more worn than the last time I saw her, as if the creature had drained the last of her vitality. "You don't have much time," she whispered, looking directly at me as if she knew I understood the weight of her statement. "Your Majesty, the creature is loose," I said, trying to remain calm. "It's hunting us. We need your help. We need to know what more there is about this thing. What is it? How was it sealed here? And why does it seem connected to you?" She closed her eyes, her expression a mix of pain and resignation. After a moment of silence, she began to speak, her voice wavering. "The thing that is loose is not just a creature, Mr. Elwood. It is a curse that runs through our family's bloodline from ancient times. My lineage, we are its guardians, or more accurately, its jailers." Her words hit me like stones sinking into the pit of my stomach. "Guardians," I murmured, not fully understanding. Yes, centuries ago, my ancestors made a pact with forces that should never have been tampered with. In exchange for power and prosperity, a member of our family was sealed along with the creature in a chamber beneath the palace. Over the generations, the royal bloodline became both the key and the prison for that thing. She hesitated, her eyes filled with deep torment. "Royal blood is what keeps the monster confined. But now it wants to break free of us, just as we depend on it." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in my mind. The creature wasn't just a being imprisoned physically, it was tied to the royal family in a much deeper, symbiotic way. Time, however, had worn down the pact, and the beast was on the verge of breaking free. What I had witnessed wasn't just a monster seeking freedom, it was the unraveling of an ancient bond. "Then what must we do?" I asked, the urgency in my voice growing. "How can we stop it?" The Queen looked at me with an expression that chilled me to the bone. "There is only one way," she whispered. "The bloodline must be broken. Royal blood must be sacrificed to seal it again. Only then can the bond be restored and the evil contained." The weight of her words fell upon me like a shroud of despair. Sacrifice. The only way to contain the creature would be to end the royal bloodline itself, a final act that would extinguish both the monster and the monarchy. Before I could fully process what she had said, the sound of the door being smashed echoed through the corridor. The creature was near. Its infernal screams reverberated through the palace, and its presence approached, bringing chaos in its wake. The Queen rose slowly, as if every movement was a struggle against the pain inside her. She walked toward me and extended an ornate silver dagger. "You know what must be done," she said, her eyes pleading for a final release. My hand trembled as I took the dagger, the cold metal pulsing in my palm. She knew, as did I, that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The fate of the nation and all humanity depended on one final act. The weight of the dagger in my hand was immense, not for its mass but for the terrifying meaning it carried. The Queen stared at me, her eyes filled with a grim acceptance and desperation. We both knew that the necessary sacrifice was not only physical but symbolic as well. The end of the royal bloodline would mean the containment of the beast, but it would also mark the conclusion of an era, a history that had been maintained for centuries at the cost of dark secrets and sinister pacts. The creature's roar echoed down the corridors, drawing ever closer. The sound of doors being ripped apart by the power of its claws reverberated in my bones. The entire palace seemed to pulsate with negative energy, as if the very structure was shrouded in a curse. With each step the beast took, it grew closer to reaching us, and with it, the chaos that would consume not just Buckingham but all of England, perhaps the entire world. My mind raced as I looked at the Queen, weakened by the burden she had carried for so long. Her ancestors' pact had been a curse, a fatal mistake that now demanded its final price. And I, Jonathan Elwood, had been dragged to the center of this macabre story, like a puppet manipulated by fate. "Your Majesty," I began, my voice weak, almost inaudible, "is there no other way?" She slowly shook her head, her gaze filled with sadness and resignation. "I have tried all methods, all rituals. What we unleashed should never have been touched. Now, there is no turning back." The Queen touched the hilt of the dagger in my hands, her fingers trembling. "You must act quickly, Jonathan, before it reaches us. If the creature takes me, it will be the end." A lump formed in my throat. This was an execution disguised as mercy, a release wrapped in desperation. Yet I knew that if I hesitated for another second, not only would the Queen be destroyed, but we all would. The next roar of the creature shook the walls. It was close enough now that we could feel the heavy, putrid air it carried with it. A grotesque shadow began to creep down the corridor, and with it, the sensation that death was coming, not just in physical form but as an obliteration of everything we understood as reality. The Queen closed her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly, but her lips formed one last, tragic smile. She had accepted her fate, while I still struggled with the terror of being the executioner of an entire legacy. "May England forgive me," she whispered, her face turning toward the ceiling, as if seeking some comfort from above. The creature was almost at the doorway when I raised the dagger. The blade flickered in the dim firelight, reflecting my hesitation and fear. I knew there was no time for regrets, no room for mercy. My heart pounded, and each beat seemed to count the seconds we had left. With a swift, precise motion, I plunged the dagger into the Queen's chest. The sound of the metal piercing her flesh was muffled by the creature's very breath, which now invaded the room, filling the air with an indescribable scream. Victoria's face contorted in a mixture of pain and relief. Her eyes opened one last time, locking onto mine with an intensity that pierced my soul. And then, like a candle snuffed out by a fierce wind, her life extinguished. As the royal blood touched the stone floor, a tremendous energy swept through the room. A deep red glow enveloped the Queen's body, and from somewhere deep in the palace's foundations, a cracking sound, as if invisible chains were breaking, echoed through every corner. The creature, which had been charging toward us in fury, suddenly stopped. Its red eyes, once filled with hatred and hunger, now seemed confused, almost lost. It screamed, a deafening and agonizing sound, which made the air vibrate and the walls tremble. It was the sound of something being dragged back, as if being sucked into an abyss from which it should never have emerged. The beast's form began to contort, its outlines distorting as it struggled against the invisible force, pulling it back into the depths. Its claws scratched the ground, trying to resist, but the blood sacrifice had already been made. The floor beneath us began to crack, and the creature was finally dragged back into the underground from which it had come, enveloped in a storm of shadows and screams. The last echo of its lament reverberated off the palace walls, and then everything fell into an oppressive silence. I collapsed to my knees beside the Queen's body, my hands still stained with the blood that had sealed both fates, of the royal bloodline and the creature it had been destined to contain. The room, now empty of any malevolent presence, felt unbearably cold. The scholars and guards who had followed me stood frozen, unable to process what they had witnessed. What had I done? I had killed the Queen to save the world from a greater evil, but the consequences of that act would reverberate for generations. England had just lost its sovereign, and I knew that, even with Victoria's sacrifice, the secret of the Beast of Buckingham would never be revealed to the public. It would be yet another mystery buried in the corridors of power. With the dagger still in my hands, I stood up with difficulty. The guards, shocked, rushed to the Queen's body, but there was nothing more to be done. Her blood now became part of the palace's stones, sealing the creature's fate forever. Or at least, that's what I hoped. As I left the room, I was overcome by a strange sensation, a sort of emptiness. The monster had been contained, the bloodline broken. Yet the weight of that moment, the weight of the sacrifice and the lies surrounding the throne, would continue to haunt me. I knew that, despite having averted the catastrophe, the price demanded by fate would be higher than I could bear. As I left Buckingham Palace behind, the darkness over London seemed to have changed. Something in the air felt different, but the city, as always, remained indifferent to what had happened at its heart. I, on the other hand, would forever carry the burden of knowing what lurked beneath its foundations. I, Jonathan Elwood, had been part of the destruction of a royal bloodline to save the world from a curse that should never have been awakened, and I knew, with cold certainty, that history would never repeat itself. But every night, as I close my eyes, the echoes of the creature still reverberate in my dreams, reminding me that some secrets should remain forever buried in the darkest depths of power. As I left Buckingham Palace behind, the London dawn began to emerge, dissipating the darkness that had accompanied me. The fog wrapped everything in a thick veil, and the night no longer seemed so ordinary. It was as if the air around me was imbued with something that couldn't be explained. I walked aimlessly, feeling the weight of Queen Victoria's death hanging over me, along with the guilt for the bloodline I had just extinguished. The streets empty echoed the final moments of that night. Each step I took, the sound of my boots on the pavement reminded me of the end I had witnessed. The queen, the creature, the ancient pact, everything had intertwined in a horror story from which I could never disentangle myself. And now, with the monarchy's blood staining my hands, I wondered if I would ever find peace again. The beast had been contained, for now, but something in me knew that evil, once unleashed, never truly disappears. It hides in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And the price paid to seal it this time, the sacrifice of a queen and the end of her bloodline, would be just another chapter in a grim story that would surely be retold. I wondered how long it would be before another generation, another curious and daring soul, would descend into that subterranean chamber once more, seeking to understand the secrets buried there. Perhaps in the future, someone else would face the terror I had faced, and perhaps, like me, they would pay the ultimate price for their curiosity. But for now, silence hung over the palace, and the beast of Buckingham went back to sleep. As I turned the last corner, the pale light of dawn began to creep in, dispersing the darkness that had accompanied me. But inside I knew that shadow would never leave me. I would carry the burden of that night for the rest of my days. The dark secret of the palace's underground would remain locked away with me, buried deep in the annals of history. But the question that would haunt me until my last breath was, for how long?